these systems are so complex, and there really isn't, one thing, one number that can be taken in isolation that tells us, everything about our health. We always need to be interpreting the total picture when it comes to blood work and when it comes to the human being in front of us.
That's one of the great things about you. It's really hard to find a heart doctor or a heart surgeon that also understands a ketogenic carnivore lifestyle. Even getting a doctor that understands carnivore is quite interesting. So, given that you see patients, heart patients, do you ever recommend a statin? Is there a place for statins with your patients?
Yeah, the place that I recommend statins is if I have someone that is, insulin resistant, does have inflammation, and their LDL cholesterol is high, and they don't want to do anything about the inflammation and the insulin resistance. They're not willing to go on a low carb carnivore diet or make the lifestyle changes. In that situation, there is a small benefit to taking statins. And what I help people to understand is that benefit is quite small. It's not this massive benefit that most doctors think it is. And there's a trade-off over the long run, and possibly in the short term, right? Statins, like every medication, they have side effects that we have to be concerned about. But like I said, if you're not going to do, what needs to be done to address these other factors, then in that situation, it may make sense to take a statin. You just have to understand that it's not really solving your problem.
What are the side effects that we're talking about here? Because personally, some members of my family, they take a statin. If they can
Minions
hear
have
from you, a
spawned.
cardiac heart surgeon, what are some side effects long term for people that don't change their diet, but they take a statin?
Yeah, so the two biggest long-term effects I worry about with statins, number one is that they increase insulin resistance. And, insulin resistance is the root cause of heart disease. So we're taking care of this cholesterol that, plays a part in the heart disease process, but we're actually worsening, a primary driver of the disease process. And that's why I think the benefit is so small with statins, because you're making one thing a little bit better, but you're making another thing worse. So that's top of my list reason that I'm not a big fan of statins. The second problem that I see with long-term use is the memory issues and the neurocognitive issues that come up with long-term statin use. And the other reason that I think statin use is so problematic is, again, because it gives people this false sense of security. It gives the patients and the doctors this false sense of security that they're taking care of the heart disease and that they're not going to get heart disease. And the unfortunate reality is today, the majority of the patients that end up on my operating table are on these medications and have been on these medications for years, and yet they still end up with the heart disease. So that's really why I am so critical of statins. It's because they've given this false impression of fixing the problem when you're not. A story for you, when I was going through my training as a surgeon,
I will blaze a trail.
and I was deciding what, area of surgery I wanted to specialize in. And this is early 2000s. And I, was talking to my mentors that I was really interested in heart surgery. I found it, interesting, and I liked that area. And they all told me, don't go into heart surgery. There's going to be nothing for you to do in 15, 20 years because we have the answer to heart disease. Statins at this time were the most widely prescribed class of medications, and it was felt that we were going to eliminate heart disease. Well, here we are, 20 plus years later. I'm busier than ever as a heart surgeon. There's actually a shortage of heart surgeons in the United States. There aren't enough heart surgeons to do the surgery that needs to be done. And heart disease, like we said earlier, is still far and away the number one killer.
As Dr. Ovadia mentions, heart disease is still the number one killer worldwide, and there are really easy ways to stop this from happening. primarily through what we eat. And later in the episode, Dr. Avedi will talk about the high-fat nutritional approach to help you fix existing heart disease and also prevent it. And I do want to point out that while heart health is so important, our mental health is also very important. And for those that don't know, I suffered from a mental health disorder from a very young age. It's not something that I wanted to share at that time. It's not something I wanted to talk about with my family and friends as I was suffering. And what I found completely fixed me, along with a high fat carnivore lifestyle, was to understand my emotions and my thoughts through therapy. And my therapist gave me incredible practical solutions, things like meditation, gratitude, diaphragmatic breathing, journaling, and this weird ice cube sensory activity. Basically, it redirects your focus. This has helped me so much, and that is why I have BetterHelp as a sponsor of today's video. BetterHelp is on a mission to help you achieve your health goals, whether it's a New Year's goal or like me, dealing with anxiety. And it's really easy to get started. All you have to do is fill out a questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. And if the first therapist doesn't feel quite right, you can easily switch to another one until you find someone you truly connect with. So if you feel that you're struggling or you might feel overwhelmed, you might want to consider therapy. Simply click on the link in the description of this episode or just head to betterhelp.com/primal podcast and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Is that why you wrote your book, Stay Off My Operating Table? Because you just want to help people not actually be on that table and fix their life?
Yeah, exactly. You know, my role as a doctor, right, is to do what's best for the patient in front of me. And I know that, you know, no matter how good I might be as a heart surgeon, no matter how good all the heart surgeons out there might be, you're never as good after you had the surgery as you would have been if you didn't need the surgery in the first place. And, you know, as I came to this realization of, you know, what we were getting wrong about heart disease, how we were failing these patients, you know, I was obligated, I felt obligated to try and get this information out to as many people as possible. And that's, you know, what led me to write the book.
Out of your 20 years seeing patients, what was the most challenging or difficult patient that you've ever come across?
Well, you know, it's hard for me to point to one patient. But, you know, what has become, I would say, the most challenging group of patients is the younger and younger patients that I'm seeing. So, I mean, the opening chapter of the book is an unfortunate story about a young mother, you know, in her 40s who presented with devastating heart disease and couldn't be saved. And, you know, unfortunately, I see stories like that more and more. And when I started my career, you know, 25 years ago now, we operated mostly on 70, 80-year-olds. We had 60-year-olds and the occasional 50-year-old. It was unheard of to be operating on 40 and 30-year-olds. And yet today I do that on a routine basis. So we're seeing the heart disease develop earlier and earlier. And, you know, like I said, you know, no matter how good I am as a surgeon, right, if I'm doing the surgery on a 30-year-old, I know that they do not have a great, you know, long-term prognosis. And their lifespan is likely to be cut short by this unless they address the underlying cause, what's really causing their heart disease. And that's why we need to get them focused on insulin resistance, inflammation, the things that we've been talking about.
Let's talk about the absolute root cause of heart disease. So people have the right information when it comes to fixing heart disease. First question though, if somebody has plaque in the arteries, can that actually be reversed through doing these dietary measures that we're going to talk about?
Yes, it can. I see it fairly routinely in my practice these days that we see, you know, we use the coronary artery calcium scan to measure the heart disease, and we can talk about that in more detail. But based on coronary artery calcium scans, I do see scores going down now on a fairly regular basis. Now, what's important to understand, and what I tell people is, our main goal is to stop it from getting worse. If it gets better, great. But as long as we stop it from getting worse, most people are going to be just fine. And so that's the main goal that I set, that we stabilize the disease. But we do now see many cases of disease starting to reverse.
Okay, so let's talk about insulin resistance and its role in heart disease, because maybe people don't understand how does that cause this. Can you kind of explain how an insulin resistant person can get heart disease from an elevated insulin state?
Yeah, so it turns out that there are a couple of pathways by which insulin resistance leads to heart disease, and this is interesting stuff, right? So the one I would say is most obvious is when insulin resistance progresses and people's blood sugars start to increase. That increased blood sugar causes damage to the blood vessels, and that's kind of the most obvious linkage between insulin resistance and heart disease. But there are a couple of other things that go on with insulin resistance that contribute to heart disease as well. It turns out that at a sort of cellular level, the mechanisms of insulin resistance, we're talking about the sort of receptors on the cell that are involved in this. There's some crossover with a chemical called nitric oxide. People may have heard of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is one of the chemicals that our body makes to help protect our blood vessels. So nitric oxide causes the blood vessels to relax and kind of enlarge some. And nitric oxide also helps protect the endothelium, that lining of the blood vessel that we're trying to keep intact. And when you're insulin resistant, it causes your nitric oxide levels to decrease. And so this is another reason why insulin resistance can cause heart disease. The third pathway that I would talk about is the inflammation we were talking about earlier. Insulin resistance causes inflammation in the body. That inflammation, among other places, can damage the blood vessels and again lead to this heart disease problem. So there are actually multiple reasons why insulin resistance causes heart disease. And what's interesting is the studies that were done back in the 1960s, 1970s, before we became so focused on cholesterol, really showed that when tested for properly, nearly every patient that presents with heart disease has insulin resistance.
Do you think then people need to focus on fixing the insulin resistance and not focus on the cholesterol?
Yeah, I think insulin resistance needs to be first and foremost. You know, we can argue about whether or not you still need to focus on cholesterol, right? And I would rather have someone focus on both than, only focus on the cholesterol and ignore the insulin resistance, which is the most common thing I see these days, right? And again, as we were talking about, the vast majority of the time when you go to see your doctor, if they're talking to you about heart disease, they are focused on your cholesterol and your cholesterol only. So, when I'm talking to my colleagues in cardiology, and I don't necessarily start off with you're wrong about cholesterol. What I start with is, okay, but let's also think about this other thing, the insulin resistance.
What do you think about red meat in the sense of heart disease? Does it cause heart disease?
Absolutely not. That is one that we can say 100% red meat does not cause heart disease. It never has, it never will, and it's just unfortunate that, I spend so much time and many others spend so much time trying to undo this myth. And it was a total myth. It was never scientifically proven in any, good way that red meat causes heart disease. And we find ourselves in this situation where we now have to disprove something that was never proven in the first place.
So if somebody has, so even for me, I eat a lot of red meat because obviously I do a carnivore diet. My cholesterol the total cholesterol is elevated, LDL is elevated according to what the doctor says, but in the presence of low HbA1c, low blood glucose, low triglycerides, I am pretty healthy, right?
Yeah, it sounds like it to me. And, the only thing I would recommend to someone like yourself to kind of make extra sure about this is go ahead and get that coronary artery calcium scan and see what's going on in your arteries. And also understand that, for most people, right, who have come to a carnivore diet or low carb diets in general, right, they've come to it later in life. And there may have been 40, 50, 60 years of not doing that, right? And so we might see some damage to your arteries. We might see some plaque in your arteries. Don't panic about that. The key is now we want to follow that over time. And after you've been on the low-carb carnivore diet for a year or 2 years, repeat that scan and see, is the plaque still accumulating? Has the plaque changed any? That's, another key thing to realize, as we're trying to figure out this whole picture around heart disease. Because if you have some plaque, but it's not to the point where you're having symptoms or, you need a stent or anything like that, as long as we stop it from getting worse, we're going to be fine. And if you do the right things, there's a chance you might see some reversal.
Perfect. So the next thing I should do is get a CAC score, and we're going to talk about some other tests that people can do as well. Do you think butter causes heart disease?
Butter does not cause heart disease.
Why?
You shouldn't be asking why doesn't butter cause heart disease. The people who think it does cause heart disease, I say why. Show me the mechanism, right? Because we know butter doesn't cause insulin resistance, it reverses it. We know butter doesn't cause inflammation, it reverses it. And they'll say that butter, contains saturated fat, and it does, but saturated fat does not cause heart disease either. That has been thoroughly disproven at this point. So I always turn that question around and say, explain to me why we thought butter caused heart disease in the first place. That's really the question we should be asking.
Okay, let's talk about what causes the actual cause of heart disease. In terms of foods, I've got buckets here so people can understand bucket 1 to bucket 5, and then you can elaborate more on these. So bucket 1 is ultra-processed carbs and sugars. In that bucket includes bread, pasta, cereals. Why is that bad, and why does that cause heart disease?
Yeah, so this is a big one. And, what's important to understand about these things, there's two components of processed food that we need to think about. There's the highly processed carbohydrates, the sugar, the grains that are highly processed. Those are going to contribute towards insulin resistance. And then we have the highly processed fats that are oftentimes used in these products. The things like vegetable and seed oil. And vegetable and seed oils, again, there are many things they do within our body that lead to inflammation and insulin resistance. And so combining these two is especially problematic. And that's why ultra-processed food is really the primary, driver in our modern food environment of not only heart disease, but, the other metabolic diseases as well.
So if somebody's thinking, what is an ultra-processed food? Because we have different definitions now. Give an example. If you go out and about, what are you going to see that's an ultra-processed carb or sugar?
Yeah, so, what I tell people is if your grandmother or great-grandmother wouldn't have recognized that as food, that's an ultra-processed food that you shouldn't be eating. If it has an ingredient list, right, that you don't know, like all the things on that ingredient list aren't something that you could go out into nature and, grow yourself or pick or kill, then, that's an ultra-processed food that you shouldn't be eating.
Okay, and that includes cereals because cereals is an ultra-processed food, multiple ingredients. We're told it's healthy. Oatmeal is not healthy either. The next one, which is bucket 2, is you mentioned industrial seed oils, but that's even when you are cooking with oils like vegetable oils, canola oil, that is going to contribute towards heart disease.
Yeah, definitely so. And again, these oils are highly inflammatory, especially when they're heated. So cooking with them becomes even more problematic. Now understand, the whole process of making these oils involves heating them and chemically treating them. And this is what makes them so toxic, so problematic, is the damage that's done to them, even, in the process of making them. And then that can be further amplified by cooking them and bringing them up to high temperature. So I am not an advocate for cooking with them at all, and I'm not an advocate for having them as an ingredient in anything that we're eating.
Okay, next one is fake heart healthy foods like margarine.
Yep. And again, these things are all contain these vegetable and seed oils. And the vegetable and seed oils are really a major part of this story, right? We came to believe, right, that lowering cholesterol was good for our heart health. And then we had these oils that lower cholesterol. And I don't deny that they lower your LDL level. It's just a question of whether that's actually good for your health and how they're doing that. And we now know, we have all of the levels of evidence, right, that we talk about in science that implicate these things in our, as a contributor to poor health, right? You can look at and again, many of us are rightly critical of epidemiologic data, but we have epidemiologic data showing these things are problematic. We have the interventional trials that are done with these vegetable and seed oils, and they've all been a failure. They don't show the benefits that they're supposed to show. They don't reduce death overall. They actually increase it in the number of trials. And they really don't reduce the heart disease deaths when the trials look at it in a good way. There have been a couple of poorly done trials that purported to show this, but those are, now at this point, discredited trials. And we know the biochemical mechanism by which they cause the damage. When these alterated fats get into our mitochondria, right, the power plants of the cells, they gum up the machinery, right, because our bodies can't process these fats properly. Saturated fats, that we get from animal products that are in nature, and even the monounsaturated fats that might be in things like olive oil, our bodies know and can utilize these. These polyunsaturated fats were never in our environment anywhere near the amount that they are today. Yes, there are small amounts of it, right? And even in something like, beef, there's going to be very small amounts of these unsaturated fats. They're non-processed, right? So they haven't undergone that whole chemical processing to, and then, they're not oxidized generally when they're introduced from something like beef. But that's a whole lot different. And then the amount of them is really what is the problem. These things have gone up by 50, maybe even 100 times in our food supply over the past 50 to 70 to 100 years. And that's when we see heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, all of these things increasing. It's interesting. I'll admit my thinking on this, has evolved over time. And, I started off by thinking it was the carbohydrates, it was the sugar that was the primary cause of the damage. I now think that it's the vegetable and seed oils that caused the damage in the first place. And then once we have that mitochondrial damage and we have the insulin resistance, now the sugar and the carbohydrates become problematic because our body can no longer process them.
And it's interesting to note that the ultra-processed foods contain the refined carbohydrates coupled with the vegetable seed oils, which is exactly what we're talking about. I think people can get confused by that, as probably health experts are also confused which ones come first and what's the mechanism of disease and why does disease happen. The next one is pretty easy. Alcohol, that's bucket 4. As a carnivore, do you ever have alcohol?
It's pretty rare for me, to be honest. Alcohol is not beneficial to our health. And again, despite what you hear, right? You hear these studies that say, a glass of red wine a day is going to be beneficial. And it's not, right? What those studies actually show is that it might mitigate some of the damage from the food we're eating, right? It has these antioxidants that maybe can help lower some of this oxidative damage that we've been concerned about. But all in all, alcohol is not a benefit to your health. And it's interesting to me to see how many people, as they do a low-carb carnivore diet, as they get healthier, they just simply lose their desire for alcohol. It just, again, probably has to do with the brain chemistry, and I certainly put myself in that category. I'm not an absolutist about it. I'll have a drink every once in a while, and when I do, it's going to be zero carb alcohol. Usually for me, it's going to be a scotch or a bourbon without any sugar mixer in it, a lot of times I end up not even finishing the drink. I've turned into a cheap date, you could say.
It's interesting that the level of alcohol, it affects people on a ketogenic diet. So, if you could have a drink on a normal carb diet, you probably will feel the effects much more on a ketogenic diet. Last bucket, that foods that are going to cause heart disease. So anything packaged with bad ingredients, even things that are marketed as healthy for you is not good. Look at the pack and look at the ingredients.
Yeah, realize that those labels about them being heart healthy or other health claims, these are all advertising. In the case of the heart healthy label from the American Heart Association, that is a paid for label. The food company has paid the American Heart Association to put that on the label. So it is pure advertising, and the only thing that you can believe on a food package is that nutritional label. Now, I'll caution that even that you want to be a little suspicious of, because there are games that get played there as well. But look at the ingredient list. That's the key. And the ideal foods, they don't have an ingredient list. They don't need it. You look at it, you know what it is. It's a steak. It's, it's a vegetable, right? It's a fruit even. You can look at it, you know what it is. It doesn't need an ingredient list. Or, maybe you're looking at something that has an ingredient list that is only combining, those things that you know what they are. I really don't believe any of these chemicals are healthy for us. There's a lot more focus on the dyes and the stuff that are going into these foods, and which ones of them may not be healthy. And in reality, I don't think any of them are healthy. And the other kind of thing that people need to sort of come to grips with is they're just not necessary, right? You can survive without these things. So why would you be introducing them?
Do you think that a high-fat diet could actually fix heart disease?
Yes, I've seen it.
In patients, you've seen it.
In patients, right? They go on the high-fat, low-carb, diet. They eliminate the processed food, right? And it's important what type of fat. You want to be using the natural animal fats and the minimally processed fruit fats. Coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil, these things are okay to use as well. I prefer the animal fats, but, those things are okay. And eating a lot of those fats in combination with animal protein, I've seen it improve heart disease. So I don't have to really theorize about it. I've seen it, and I know it helps with heart disease.
Okay, I like to play a game here. I'm going to give you some foods, and you tell me, can you eat as much of this as you want until you feel satiated? And that's going to help someone fix their heart disease. First one, beef?
Definitely so.
How about eggs?
Definitely so.
How many can you eat a day? How many eggs?
I don't know that there's a limit. I do, I have become a little bit more cautious, and I talk to people about the source of the eggs, right? Because you do have to be concerned about what that chicken is being fed. And if they're being fed a bunch of corn and soy, that can translate to more of these polyunsaturated fatty acids in the egg. Now, again, I don't know that the polyunsaturated fatty acids in that situation are as damaging and as concerning as they are in the bottle of vegetable and seed oil, but I have become a little bit more cautious about, the source of your eggs. I think if you have well-sourced eggs, the chickens are truly eating what they're supposed to be eating out there in the pasture. You can eat as many of them as you want. If you're not sure about the source of your eggs and what the chicken was eating, you might want to, be a little bit more careful. That doesn't mean don't eat eggs. Just means maybe you don't want to do a dozen a day of those types of eggs.
So if I have pasture-raised eggs, as I do, highest quality, I have 6 in the morning. My husband has a dozen. Totally fine. Totally fine.
Totally fine.
This is going to be hilarious. People are going to think you guys are crazy for saying that. But if they can understand that the saturated fat and the good fat is good for you, it's going to fix your heart and fix heart disease, they'll understand that eggs, beef, and lamb is the next one, is good for you. Is lamb good?
Yeah, lamb is excellent. Lamb in many ways might even be better than beef. And I know some people, that might trigger them a little bit. But lamb actually, when you look again at that kind of fatty, the profile of their fat, it probably has some advantages over beef, especially, the other thing is that most lamb, right, is grass-fed, grass-finished. We haven't really gotten into grain finishing lamb. They haven't figured out how to ruin lamb quite yet, as they have with, some beef. So lamb is a great food to be eating.
I didn't know that. I'm going to eat more lamb then if it's kind of all grass-fed, because I currently have grain-fed beef. It's delicious, but if I can get grass-fed lamb and it's at the same price or even cheaper than beef. What do you think about, so we spoke about butter. Does butter unclog the arteries?
So I don't know that we can say that butter unclogs the arteries, right? Butter has the fats that aren't going to clog the arteries. And if you're substituting those for the fats that do clog the arteries, indirectly, there can be, an unclogging effect, right? It's some of it is what you're taking away as much as what you're eating.
I love asking these questions because you're very on point and diplomatic. And in a way, it does unclog the arteries, but you have to be careful to say it doesn't directly, but if you're not having these other fats, it is going to help have good, healthy arteries. Okay, last few. Raw milk, good or bad for heart disease?
Yeah, I think raw milk is great for our overall health, and I have no concerns about it when it comes to heart disease.
Wow, raw cheese?
Raw cheese, great as well. Yep.
Honey?
So honey, I think, is going to be situational. If you're not insulin resistant, if you're active, I think honey can be incorporated into the diet safely. The problem is that most people are insulin resistant to some degree, and therefore they are going to, honey, which is sugar, is going to be problematic for them. But I think if you are, like I said, if you're insulin sensitive, you're active, you have good muscle mass, and you want to incorporate some type of sugar, I think raw honey is one of the best types of sugar that we can incorporate into the diet.
Okay, any limit on salt if somebody wants to fix heart disease?
If it's real salt, there's no limit. If it's processed salt, that's where it becomes problematic. So, the reason that salt has become associated with high blood pressure and heart disease is the vast majority of salt, at least in the Western diet, comes from processed food. So it really became the marker for processed food. The unprocessed, good sea salt or good Himalayan salt, whatever it might be, that is not problematic, and people shouldn't limit that in any way.
Okay, so we've been talking about some foods that kind of cater towards a carnivore diet, except for the honey. I want to open it up to people that might include some vegetables, maybe do ketogenic, low carb. Is that okay to fix heart disease? And what vegetables and salads are okay?
Yeah, so I think it can be. And again, this is where you need to be assessing, where you're starting from. The more insulin resistant you are, the less you can tolerate carbohydrates, even if those are coming from a clean, vegetable source, like, broccoli, cauliflower, something like that. And so, these are situations where